Osama bin Laden, Rise, Reign, and the Final Night: How America Hunted the Most Wanted Man on Earth. Part 1: The Rise, from Prince of Wealth to Warrior of God. He was born into a kingdom built on sand and oil, into a dynasty where faith and fortune lived side by side. In the year 1957, in the city of Riyadh, a boy was born to a woman of Yemeni origin and a man who built empires with cement and prayer. That boy was Osama bin Muhammad bin Awad bin Laden, the 17th son of a construction magnate whose company had built the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina. To most, he was destined for ease. The bin Ladens were no ordinary family. They were deeply connected to the royal household of Saudi Arabia, billionaires long before the world used the word so easily. They were the architects of modern Arabia, their machines digging the foundations of a kingdom rising from desert dust. Osama, however, was different. While his brothers traveled abroad, embracing the new world of Western education and modern business, he stayed behind, quiet, withdrawn, pious. He memorized verses of the Quran. He studied the writings of preachers who spoke of purity, struggle, and sacrifice. He avoided music, luxury, and laughter. Even as a teenager, he lived like an ascetic in a palace. By the time he was in university, the world around him was on fire. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, setting off a war that would redraw borders and beliefs alike. Across the Muslim world, imams declared that every able-bodied man had a duty, a jihad, to defend Muslim lands from the infidel invader. To Osama, this was no political struggle. It was divine destiny. He left the marble corridors of Jeddah's King Abdulaziz University and went to the mountains of Afghanistan. He was not a fighter at first, he was a financier, an organizer, a builder. He used his wealth to create supply chains of faith, food, medicine, rifles, and roads for the Mujahideen, the holy warriors resisting the Soviet tanks. But soon, the boy of privilege became a soldier of faith. He saw death up close, the brutality of bombs, the faces of martyrs. And in the smoke and ruin, something within him hardened. It was in those mountains that he discovered what power felt like, not the power of money, but the power of belief. Men followed him, listened to him, died for him. He built networks of trust and command. Among these warriors, he became a leader, respected, feared, mythic. When the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989, the West celebrated the end of an empire. But in the caves of Khost and the valleys of Tora Bora, another empire was being imagined, not of land, but of ideology. Bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia a hero in his own eyes, but his country no longer felt like home. The palaces glittered, but to him, they stank of betrayal. He saw the royal family growing closer to the United States, hosting American companies, American bases, and American soldiers. The same Americans who, he believed, had polluted Islamic lands with their culture and greed. The fracture widened when 1990 brought the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, and with it, a fateful choice for Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, fearing Saddam's army, invited U.S. troops to station on their soil, the birthplace of Islam, the land of Mecca and Medina. To Osama, it was blasphemy. He offered to defend the kingdom himself, with his network of mujahideen. The royal family laughed him off. That humiliation burned deep. He began to speak publicly against the monarchy and the Americans they hosted. He declared that the presence of non-Muslim soldiers on Holy Land was a crime against God. Saudi Arabia silenced him, revoked his passport, froze his assets. But you cannot exile conviction. He left for Sudan in 1992, taking with him his wealth, his followers, and his vision, a vision that had transformed into something darker. There, in the dusty outskirts of Khartoum, he built training camps, farms, factories, and a new kind of organization. He called it Al-Qaeda, the base. It would be unlike anything the world had ever faced. Not a state, not an army, but a network, elastic and invisible, bound by ideology, not borders. And its sole purpose was to wage a global war against the United States and its allies, to drive them out of Muslim lands, to break their will, and to bleed them until they collapsed. What began as a holy resistance against Soviet occupation had become a personal vendetta against the West. Bin Laden had turned from warrior to prophet in his own mind, and prophecy demanded proof. He believed that America's strength was an illusion, that the nation was a paper tiger. He wanted to test that belief. And so, he began to strike. Part 2: The Network, Al-Qaeda's Rise and the Road to 9/11. By the mid-1990s, the world had almost forgotten Osama bin Laden. He lived quietly in Sudan, a guest of a sympathetic government that admired his wealth and his zeal. But beneath the calm, something vast and dangerous was taking shape. Bin Laden's compounds buzzed with activity. Engineers, clerics, former fighters, and idealists from across the Muslim world came to join him. They trained in the desert under the sun, practicing guerrilla warfare, assembling bombs, and studying theology twisted into justification for violence. He gave speeches that electrified his followers, sermons that spoke of injustice, humiliation, and divine vengeance. He claimed the Muslim world had been enslaved by Western powers, politically, economically, and spiritually, and that the only path to redemption was jihad. He framed America not as a country but as an empire of corruption, the puppet master behind every tyranny, every occupation, every insult to Islam. And soon, his words became actions. In 1992, a bomb exploded in a hotel in Yemen housing U.S. troops, their first brush with bin Laden's reach. In 1993, the first attack on the World Trade Center rocked New York, planned by men inspired by his ideology. And in 1998, he delivered his first global message, a fatwa, a declaration of war against the United States. The ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it. He wrote. The world barely noticed. But the men in his orbit were already plotting on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before. His organization Al-Qaeda had become a spider web of secret cells stretching from Afghanistan to Hamburg, Nairobi to New York. Each node worked in shadows, yet all were bound by the same command. Meanwhile, bin Laden found a new sanctuary. Under pressure from global powers, Sudan expelled him in 1996. He returned to Afghanistan, a nation torn by civil war, ruled now by a radical militia known as the Taliban. They gave him refuge. He gave them wealth, men, and legitimacy. From the caves of Tora Bora, bin Laden built a new kind of empire, one invisible to satellites but visible to those who shared his rage. He trained soldiers not just to fight but to die willingly, joyfully. The United States was watching, but not listening. Intelligence agencies tracked rumors, intercepted chatter, but failed to connect the dots. Even after the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed over 200 people, the world underestimated him. Missiles struck his camps in retaliation, Operation Infinite Reach, but bin Laden survived. To him, it was a sign. God, he believed, was protecting him for something greater. He watched American soldiers pull out of Somalia after the Black Hawk Down incident, watched them withdraw from Lebanon after the Marine barracks bombing, and concluded one thing. When we hit America, she runs. That idea became doctrine. And so, the plan began, quiet, meticulous, monstrous. It involved years of coordination, sleeper cells, flight schools, false identities, and patience. The targets were chosen not for military value but for symbolism. The Pentagon for power. The World Trade Center for wealth. And the White House or Capitol for politics. Each was a pillar of American pride. The hijackers, 19 men from across the Middle East, were hand-picked, trained in both faith and flight. They learned to pray and to pilot. They believed death was a doorway, not an end. And then, the morning came. September 11, 2001. It was bright, cloudless, serene until it wasn't. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 tore into the South Tower. By 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. And Flight 93, its passengers fighting back, crashed in a Pennsylvania field, the only one that didn't reach its mark. The world stopped. Smoke curled over Manhattan. Steel bent, glass melted, and thousands of lives vanished in minutes. For those watching live, it felt like the apocalypse had arrived on television. And somewhere, in the mountains of Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden smiled. He had done what no army in history had achieved, struck the American mainland, humiliated the superpower, and turned its own machines into weapons against it. But he underestimated what would follow. For America, it was not the day it fell. It was the day it swore never to again. The War on Terror was born that very afternoon. The U.S. vowed to hunt him to the ends of the earth. Every intelligence agency, every drone, every soldier would be mobilized to find the man who had redefined evil. Yet as the towers fell, he disappeared into legend, a ghost in the mountains, his name whispered like a curse. Part 3: The Hunt, How America Chased a Ghost for a Decade, 2001 to 2011. The dust over Manhattan hadn't even settled when the United States began its reckoning. The world had changed, not in an instant, but in the span of a scream, a collapse, a plume of smoke that spread like grief across the earth. In those first hours after September 11, 2001, America's heart broke and hardened. There was confusion, then rage, then resolve. President George W. Bush, standing amid the ruins of Ground Zero, spoke through a bullhorn to the rescuers clawing through twisted steel. "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." The manhunt began. The target was clear: Osama bin Laden. The terrain, however, was merciless. He had vanished into the folds of Afghanistan's mountains, a labyrinth of caves, valleys, and ancient trails where empires had gone to die. The Soviet Union had bled out there. Britain had limped away before them. And now America was coming. Operation Enduring Freedom, the first strike. In October 2001, the skies over Afghanistan thundered with American firepower. Cruise missiles streaked across the horizon. B-52 bombers flattened Taliban positions. Special forces rode horseback alongside Afghan militias through the dust of Kandahar and Jalalabad, modern knights in Kevlar saddles. Within weeks, the Taliban regime that had sheltered bin Laden collapsed. Kabul fell. Kandahar fell. By Christmas, the world thought America had won. But victory in Afghanistan, as history would remind, is never that simple. Bin Laden had fled, narrowly escaping death in the Tora Bora Mountains in December 2001. U.S. troops closed in, he slipped through. His beard dusted with snow, he crossed into Pakistan under the cover of night, escorted by loyal fighters. From then on, he was a phantom. Every rumor, every whisper, every grainy photograph sent analysts spinning. One week he was in Quetta, the next in Waziristan, then gone again. The long shadow. The years that followed were a test of endurance. The war that began to capture one man grew into a crusade against an idea. America invaded Iraq in 2003, chasing phantom weapons and new enemies, but the shadow of bin Laden lingered. He became both a symbol and a strategy. Every video he released, often grainy, delivered through middlemen, was both taunt and theology. He mocked America's pain, praised the dead of 9/11, and promised that more would follow. Each broadcast reignited the hunt. Each rumor redrew the map. The CIA built entire task forces around his trail. Satellites tracked every goat path. Interrogators questioned detainees in secret prisons. Millions of dollars flowed into intelligence programs designed to find a single man hiding among millions. Still, he eluded them. He grew older, thinner, quieter. His hair silvered. His movements slowed. But his myth, that only grew. He had become something more than a fugitive. He was a symbol of invincibility to his followers, and of unfinished justice to his enemies. For the families of the victims of 9/11, it was a wound that refused to heal. Every year that passed without his capture deepened the question: how could the most powerful nation in the world not find one man? A thread in Abbottabad. Then, almost 10 years later, a clue, thin as a whisper. In August 2010, a CIA team in Pakistan tracked a man known as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, a trusted courier in bin Laden's network. He led them to a compound in the quiet Pakistani city of Abbottabad. It didn't look like much: 3 stories, high walls, barbed wire. But there were signs. No phone lines, no internet, no visitors, and most tellingly, the residents burned their trash instead of taking it out. It was a fortress hiding in plain sight. When analysts saw a tall, thin man pacing the courtyard's upper floors, always careful never to show his face, they began to whisper. The Pacer. That might be him. For months, the CIA watched. Drones hovered high above. Informants crept near. Inside Langley, models of the compound were built, studied, dissected. By March 2011, the evidence pointed to one conclusion. Osama bin Laden was there. But no one knew for certain. It could have been another mistake, another mirage in a decade of dead ends. The president had to decide. The decision. In the White House Situation Room, Barack Obama listened to his advisors weigh the risks. A drone strike could kill him, but leave no proof. A ground raid could prove his death or become a disaster if he escaped again. The memories of the failed Desert One mission to rescue hostages in Iran haunted the room. But Obama, calm and deliberate, made his choice. "We're going to go in," he said. "It's 50-50, but this is the best lead we've had in years." And so, Operation Neptune Spear was born. Part 4, The Final Night, Operation Neptune Spear and the Death of Osama bin Laden. It was a Sunday night in Washington, D.C., May 1, 2011. The sky was clear, the city quiet. But inside the White House, history was already in motion. Hundreds of miles away, in the darkness over eastern Afghanistan, two Black Hawk helicopters skimmed the terrain at treetop level, their rotors whispering through the mountain air. On board, 23 of America's most elite warriors, SEAL Team 6, sat in silence. They were ghosts in flight, bound for a small Pakistani city no one had ever imagined would hold the world's most wanted man. No one spoke. Only the hum of the engines and the thud of hearts filled the night. Each man had rehearsed this mission 100 times on a replica compound built in North Carolina. Now, this was no simulation. Their target, Abbottabad, Pakistan. Their mission, kill or capture Osama bin Laden. Into the darkness. At approximately 12:30 a.m. local time, the helicopters crossed into Pakistani airspace. No one had told Pakistan. The United States was violating an ally's sovereignty, a risk that could ignite an international crisis if discovered. The lead Black Hawk dipped low toward the compound's outer wall. But as it descended, disaster struck. The air pressure around the compound caused the aircraft to lose lift. The pilot fought to steady the bird, and then it crashed inside the walls, tail snapping against the bricks. The SEALs moved instantly. They weren't shaken, they were trained for chaos. They poured out of the wreckage, secured the perimeter, and pressed forward. Inside the compound, the family of bin Laden woke to the sound of gunfire and rotors. Children screamed. Women ran. Guards fired wildly and were silenced. One by one, the SEALs cleared the rooms. They found couriers, family members, guards, all neutralized in seconds. And then, at the top of the stairs, they reached the door. Behind it was the man who had haunted the world for a decade. The face behind the door. The point man whispered into his radio. Going up. They pushed through. In the dim light, they saw him, tall, thin, gray-bearded. He wasn't holding a gun. He wasn't wearing armor. He was standing near the bed, a wife screaming beside him. Two suppressed shots echoed in the room. One hit his chest. One struck above his left eye. Osama bin Laden collapsed onto the floor. The most hunted man on earth was dead in less than a heartbeat. In the silence that followed, the SEALs moved with ritual precision. They photographed his face. They measured his height. They bagged his body. And then, into the radio, the words that the world had waited 10 years to hear. For God in country, Geronimo, EKIA. Enemy killed in action. Half a world away, in the White House Situation Room, the tension snapped. President Obama, watching through live satellite feeds, exhaled quietly. He looked at his team and said simply, "We got him." The return. The SEALs gathered what they could: hard drives, documents, personal notes. One helicopter destroyed by the crash was blown up to protect its technology. They loaded bin Laden's body into the other, lifted off, and slipped back into the night. In just 40 minutes, they had ended a decade-long pursuit. Back in Afghanistan, his body was examined, photographed, DNA tested. There was no doubt. It was him. And within 24 hours, Osama bin Laden's body was buried at sea, according to Islamic tradition, a final act of closure designed to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. For the world, the monster was gone. But for America, the moment was bittersweet. The announcement. That night, President Obama stepped into the East Room of the White House, his face solemn, his tone measured. He began quietly. "Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda." He spoke not of triumph, but of justice, not revenge, but closure. Across America, millions poured into the streets. Outside the White House, in Times Square, at Ground Zero, people sang, cried, waved flags. Strangers embraced as if they had all survived something together. It wasn't joy. It was release. For the firefighters who'd run into the burning towers, for the families who'd spent years staring at empty chairs, for the soldiers who'd fought in distant deserts, the news meant something sacred. The story had an ending. Epilogue: The Ghost and the Legacy. In the decade after bin Laden's death, the world didn't become safer, just different. His ideology scattered, evolved, changed names. New threats rose: ISIS, lone wolves, digital radicalization. But none ever carried the mythic weight of the man in the compound. Osama bin Laden died as he lived, believing he was chosen by destiny, even as history proved otherwise. He had tried to spark a war that would humble the West and unite the East, yet in doing so, he united the world against him. And in the end, it wasn't armies or politics that defeated him, it was patience, persistence, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The mission that killed him wasn't just about vengeance. It was about restoring a wound in the American soul, about telling the world that time may dull pain, but justice, true justice, never forgets. Bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad was demolished. No trace remains. But for those who lived through the terror, the smoke, and the silence that followed 9/11, his shadow remains etched in memory. He changed the century. And in the end, the century changed him, from a man into a lesson, from a hunter into the hunted.